89 years ago, a woman climbed into a silver airplane on a muddy airstrip in New Guinea, lifted off into the morning haze, and was never seen again. No wreckage. No bodies. No debris field. Nothing. Amelia Earhart, the most famous aviator alive, vanished so completely over the Pacific Ocean that for nearly 9 decades the world has been unable to close the book on her. And right now, as you watch this, a research vessel is either already anchored off a remote coral atoll in the middle of the Pacific, or steaming toward it, carrying scientists who believe they may finally be closer than anyone has ever been to answering the question that has outlived every person who was alive to ask it in 1937. This is not a story about a discovery that has already happened. Nobody has found the plane. Not yet. But to understand why grown historians, archaeologists, and pilots have spent fortunes and years of their lives chasing a 39-year-old radio signal into the dark, you have to go back to the beginning, to a girl in Kansas who filled a scrapbook with newspaper clippings about women doing things women weren't supposed to do. Amelia Mary Earhart was born in 1897, and by most accounts her childhood gave no hint that she would become the most recognizable woman on the planet. She was raised partly by her grandparents in Atchison, Kansas, a restless, climbing, tree-scaling kid who chafed against the idea that girls were supposed to sit quietly and wait to be interesting to somebody else. She saw her first airplane at a state fair as a child and was, by her own later admission, thoroughly unimpressed. It looked like a fragile stack of rusted wire and wood, and she walked away from it without a second thought. The moment that actually changed her life came years later, in December of 1920, at an airfield in Long Beach, California. She paid $10 to take a 10-minute ride, and by the time the plane came back down, she had decided, with a kind of certainty that only rearranges an entire life once, that she needed to be in the air. She later said that as soon as she left the ground, she knew she had to fly. She scraped together money for lessons however she could, working odd jobs, and she cut her hair short in stages so her family wouldn't be shocked all at once by how much she was changing. She bought her first airplane, a second-hand Kinner Airster she nicknamed the Canary, for its bright yellow paint, and by 1922 she had set her first record, becoming the first woman to fly solo above 14,000 feet. None of this made her famous. What made her famous was 1928, when a publicist and publisher named George Putnam was looking for a woman to be the first to cross the Atlantic by air, to ride along as a kind of living proof that flight was safe enough for anyone. Earhart was chosen largely because she looked the part and had the credentials to survive the scrutiny. She flew as a passenger that time, not a pilot, and it embarrassed her. She told reporters afterward that she had been nothing more than a sack of potatoes on that flight, and she meant it as a genuine complaint about her own performance, not false modesty. She promised herself she would do the crossing again, properly, alone. 4 years later, in 1932, she kept that promise. She flew solo across the Atlantic in a Lockheed Vega, through icing conditions that coated her wings, past a cracked exhaust manifold that spat flame near the cockpit, guided partly by instinct and partly by nerve, and landed in a pasture in Northern Ireland where a startled farmhand asked if she had flown far. From America, she told him, and the world took notice in a way it hadn't for the first crossing. She became a genuine international celebrity, not a passenger who happened to be a woman, but a pilot who had crossed an ocean by herself. She used that fame relentlessly and deliberately. She lectured constantly, she wrote books about flying, she helped found the 99s, an organization for female pilots, and she designed a line of practical clothing for working women. She dined with President and Mrs. Roosevelt, and Eleanor Roosevelt herself reportedly took a nighttime flight with Earhart over Washington, still in her evening gown, because Earhart's enthusiasm for flight was simply contagious. Earhart was not just famous for what she had done. She was famous for what she represented, proof, delivered again and again in public, that a woman's ambition didn't have a ceiling built into it. By 1937, though, there was one flight left that no one, man or woman, had ever completed. Earhart wanted to circle the globe along its longest path, close to the equator, roughly 29,000 miles of ocean, jungle, and desert. Others had circled the world before her, but always along shorter, friendlier routes closer to the poles. Nobody had gone the long way around the planet's widest belt. She was 39 years old, and she told people close to her that she believed she had one big flight left in her before she settled into a quieter life. This, she said, would be the one. Her airplane was a Lockheed Electra 10E, a twin-engine, all-metal monoplane she affectionately called her flying laboratory, outfitted with the best long-range navigation equipment available at the time. Beside her sat Fred Noonan, a former sea captain and one of the most respected celestial navigators in the world, a man capable of finding a speck of land in an ocean of nothing using a sextant, a chronometer, and the stars. The first attempt, in March of 1937, ended almost before it began. Taking off from Hawaii, the Electra suffered some kind of mechanical or handling failure during the takeoff roll. Accounts differ on exactly what went wrong, and the plane ground-looped violently down the runway, tearing away part of its landing gear in a shower of sparks. The aircraft had to be shipped back to California by boat for extensive repairs, an enormous setback that would have ended most people's ambitions right there. Earhart tried again in late May, this time flying east instead of west, chasing the sun rather than racing it. Miami, then south through the Caribbean, over the shoulder of South America, across the brutal emptiness of the South Atlantic to Africa, then over Central Africa's jungles, through the punishing heat of Arabia and India and Southeast Asia. By late June she and Noonan had reached La, in New Guinea, and they had already done something extraordinary. 22,000 miles were behind them. Only about 7,000 remained, but almost all of that remaining distance was open Pacific water, and the hardest single leg of the entire journey was still ahead of them. From La, their next stop was supposed to be Howland Island, a flat sliver of sand and coral barely a mile and a half long, sitting almost alone in an ocean so vast that finding it has often been compared to finding a single grain of rice on a football field, in the dark, after 18 hours awake. To help them, the United States government positioned a Coast Guard cutter called the Itasca just offshore of Howland, pumping black smoke into the sky as a visual marker and broadcasting radio signals Earhart could theoretically home in on. On the morning of July 2, 1937, the Electra lifted off the airstrip at La, heavy with fuel, and turned out over the Pacific toward the sunrise. 4 hours. The flight seemed to be proceeding normally. Then the radio transmissions reaching the Itasca began to sound wrong. The crew could hear fragments of Earhart's voice, but she gave no indication she was receiving their replies clearly. Her messages grew tighter, more urgent. She reported cloudy weather. She said she believed she must be near the island but couldn't see it. And then, at 8:43 in the morning, came the transmission that has haunted historians and radio operators for generations. A clear, strained signal in which she said she was running on a line north and south, and that she would repeat the message. After that, nothing. The most famous pilot on Earth, her expert navigator, and their gleaming aluminum aircraft disappeared into a clear tropical sky without leaving behind a single confirmed trace. What followed was, at the time, the largest and most expensive air and sea search in American history. The Navy and Coast Guard threw a battleship, the aircraft carrier Lexington, with dozens of its own planes, cruisers, and minesweepers into the effort, along with the exhausted crew of the Itasca itself. For more than 2 weeks, hundreds of men scoured roughly 250,000 square miles of open ocean, chasing every glint of reflected light, every rumor of debris, every drifting shape that might have been wreckage or a life raft. They found nothing that could be confirmed as belonging to the Electra. No oil slick, no luggage, no aluminum, no remains. On July 19, 17 days after that final transmission, the official search was called off, and Earhart and Noonan were declared lost at sea. But a disappearance of this size and fame doesn't stay quiet just because the ships go home. It becomes a vacuum, and vacuums get filled. The most conventional explanation, and still the one most mainstream historians default to, is often called the crash and sink theory. That the Electra simply ran out of fuel somewhere near Howland, that Earhart ditched it under control on the open water, and that the aircraft sank within minutes, taking both of them down with it into water more than 3 miles deep in places. It is the least dramatic explanation, and precisely because it offers no wreckage, no grave, and no real narrative closure, it has never been fully satisfying to the public, even though it remains the most probable answer given the known fuel situation and radio evidence. The most enduring alternative is what's often called the Nikumaroro hypothesis, sometimes referred to by the older name of the island, Gardner Island. The theory holds that, unable to locate Howland, Earhart turned and flew south along her radioed navigation line until she reached this other uninhabited coral atoll, and that she managed to land the Electra on the flat reef exposed at low tide. Under this theory, she and Noonan survived, at least for a period of time, as castaways on an island with no fresh water and no rescue. This idea has been championed for decades by a non-profit called TIRE, the International Group for Historic Aircraft Recovery, led by an aviation investigator named Rick Gillespie, who has organized more than a dozen expeditions to Nikumaroro since the late 1980s. Those expeditions have returned with genuinely intriguing fragments. A piece of aluminum aircraft skin some researchers argue is consistent with a patch applied to Earhart's Electra, the sole of a woman's shoe from the 1930s, a broken jar of Dr. Barry's freckle ointment, a product Earhart is known to have used, and the remains of an old campfire. Perhaps most compelling is a set of British colonial records describing a partial human skeleton discovered on the island in 1940, along with a sextant box, which was examined at the time, measured, and then lost before modern forensic techniques existed to test it. A reanalysis of the original 1940s bone measurements, published decades later, argued that the skeletal proportions were more consistent with a woman of Earhart's height and body type than with the Pacific Islander men who were living in the region. None of this amounts to definitive proof. Every artifact has an alternate, more mundane explanation, and the bones themselves no longer exist to be tested with modern DNA science. Beyond the two leading theories sit the stranger ones, born mostly out of Cold War paranoia. One version claims Earhart's round-the-world flight was secretly a reconnaissance mission for the United States government, sent to photograph Japanese military fortifications scattered across the Pacific, and that when she went down she was captured, imprisoned, and possibly executed by Japanese forces. Supporters have pointed to old photographs they claim showed a woman resembling Earhart on a dock in the Marshall Islands, and to second-hand island testimony describing a captured white female flyer before the war. Investigators who examined the dock photograph more closely found strong evidence it predated Earhart's flight entirely, undermining the theory's centerpiece. Still stranger is the claim that Earhart secretly survived the whole ordeal, returned to the United States under an assumed identity, and lived out an ordinary life in New Jersey while the government quietly buried the truth. That version has essentially no supporting evidence at all, only the enduring human instinct to believe that someone so famous couldn't simply have vanished into nothing. For most of the 89 years since, that's roughly where things stood. Competing maps, competing coordinates, a scattering of physical fragments that never quite added up to certainty. Every decade brought a new expedition, a new set of side-scan sonar sweeps, a new confident press conference, and every time, the ocean gave back the same answer it gave the Itasca in 1937. Nothing. What has genuinely changed in just the last few years is the technology available to search with. The seafloor near Howland plunges to depths beyond 16,000 feet in places, more than 3 miles down, into a zone of total darkness and crushing pressure that no human diver and few manned submersibles can safely reach. Searching terrain like that used to require tethered sonar sleds dragged slowly behind a ship, producing blurry, ambiguous smears that could just as easily be a boulder as a wing. In just the last handful of years, autonomous underwater vehicles, torpedo-shaped robots that can be launched from a ship's deck, dive on their own to the seafloor, and fly pre-programmed survey lines for 18 or 20 hours at a stretch without a cable or a human pilot, have made it possible to map enormous stretches of deep ocean floor in genuinely high resolution. Modern synthetic aperture sonar can now resolve objects roughly a foot across, sharp enough in principle to distinguish the straight edges and right angles of something manufactured from the random contours of natural rock. That technology is exactly what powered the most publicized search attempt of the last several years. In early 2024, a company called Deep Sea Vision, founded by a former Air Force intelligence officer and commercial pilot named Tony Romeo, announced that its autonomous underwater vehicle had captured a sonar image roughly 16,000 feet down, about 100 miles from Howland Island, of an object with a shape that resembled a twin-engine aircraft resting on the seafloor. The image went everywhere. News outlets around the world ran the story under headlines suggesting the mystery might finally be solved. Aviation experts were more cautious from the start, noting that the object's wings appeared swept rather than straight, and that it lacked the visible engine housings you'd expect from an Electra. Romeo's team went back out with more advanced imaging equipment to take a closer look, and in November of 2024 they got their answer. The object was not a plane. It was a naturally occurring rock formation that happened, by pure geological coincidence, to resemble the outline of an aircraft. Romeo himself later called it the cruelest formation nature has ever created, a strange piece of bad luck that briefly convinced the entire world the search was over. That false alarm didn't end the search, it just redirected the attention of the most credible current effort back toward Nikumaroro and the older castaway theory. In 2020, an independent researcher combing through satellite imagery of the atoll's lagoon noticed an unusual shape partially buried in the sand. An anomaly that appeared, at certain angles and certain tides, to have the rough size and proportions of a Lockheed Electra. Archaeologist Richard Pettigrew of the Archaeological Legacy Institute took up the lead on investigating it, and the object became known as the Taraya object. Working with Purdue University, which has a long-standing connection to Earhart, since she served as a visiting faculty member and career counselor there in the years before her final flight and even flew from Purdue's own airfield. The two organizations announced a joint expedition in the summer of 2025 to travel to Nikumaroro and physically excavate the site. The plan was to sail from the Marshall Islands to Nikumaroro, spend several days on the remote atoll digging at the anomaly's location, and determine once and for all whether it was wreckage or simply a natural feature. That expedition, originally scheduled to depart in November of 2025, was delayed twice, first by the slow process of securing permits from the government of Kiribati, the island nation that includes Nikumaroro and the surrounding Phoenix Islands protected area, and then again by the onset of the South Pacific cyclone season, which made the remote crossing too dangerous to attempt. The team ultimately regrouped and announced a new departure date of this past October, timed symbolically to Earhart's birthday in July when the announcement was made. A 16-person team, archaeologists, safety and logistics personnel, filmmakers, and representatives from Kiribati itself, set out from Tarawa by boat, a journey of more than 800 nautical miles taking roughly 6 days to reach the atoll. The team isn't relying on the Taraya object alone. They point to the accumulated circumstantial case that's been building around Nikumaroro for decades, the 1940 bone discovery and its disputed forensic reanalysis, the freckle cream jar and shoe sole and other 1930s-era artifacts recovered from the island over multiple expeditions, and something called the Bevington object, a shape visible in a photograph of the island's reef taken just 3 months after Earhart's disappearance, which some researchers believe shows a piece of the Electra's landing gear sticking out of the water. Taken together, the argument goes, these pieces suggest a woman who didn't die anonymously somewhere over open ocean, but who came agonizingly close to a landing, and then to rescue, on a strip of coral no search plane ever thought to check closely enough. Not everyone close to this case is convinced, including some of the people who've spent the most time on it. Rick Gillespie, whose organization TIRE has championed the broader Nikumaroro hypothesis for nearly 40 years, has publicly expressed skepticism about this particular object. He's argued that the shape in the satellite imagery is more likely a downed coconut tree, shifted into that position by a major tropical storm that struck the island around 2014, and that earlier expeditions to the exact coordinates in question turned up nothing. It's a strange and telling detail. The person most responsible for keeping the general castaway theory alive for decades is not convinced this specific piece of evidence is real. That kind of internal disagreement, experts doubting other experts working from the same broad theory, is exactly the sort of caution that separates a serious investigation from a manufactured one. Nobody involved with any credibility is promising they'll dig up an intact fuselage. They're promising to go look carefully and report honestly on what they find, even if what they find is another coconut tree, another rock formation, another decade of nothing. That's genuinely where things stand right now. There is no confirmed wreck. There is no camera footage of an aircraft resting on the seafloor. There is no serial number, no riveted section of aluminum sitting in a lab somewhere waiting to be matched against Lockheed's original build records. What exists is a team of serious researchers, on a remote atoll in the middle of the Pacific, digging into sand around a shape that might be nothing more than a fallen tree, guided by nearly a century of circumstantial evidence that has never quite closed the gap between plausible and proven. The mystery of Amelia Earhart hasn't been solved by a drone, or by an algorithm, or by a dramatic camera reveal in the deep dark of the ocean. It's being chased, patiently, expensively, and honestly, by people willing to admit they might be wrong. Maybe that ends this year with a definitive answer, a scrap of aluminum with a rivet pattern that matches Lockheed's 1936 production records, or a bone fragment finally young enough in preservation to yield usable DNA. Or maybe it ends the way almost every expedition before it has ended, with a disappointing shape in the sand and a long boat ride home. Either way, there's something worth sitting with in the fact that 89 years after she disappeared, people are still willing to sail more than 800 miles into open ocean, dig by hand in coral sand, and risk being wrong in public, just for the chance to bring her home. So here's a question worth thinking about while the world waits to hear what that team finds on Nikomaroro. If they do find real wreckage there, twisted aluminum instead of driftwood, do you think it should be raised and studied and put on display so the whole story can finally be told in full? Or is there something in you that thinks a resting place, once actually found after nearly a century of searching, should simply be marked, honored, and left exactly where the ocean and the island chose to keep it?